Welcome to Backstage Melody, where we peel back the glossy surface of your favorite songs to uncover the raw truth beneath. And today, we're diving into the heartbreak, deception, and regret behind one of the most iconic tracks of the 80s. George Michael wasn't proud of Careless Whisper. In fact, he spent years trying to distance himself from it. Behind the chart-topping success was a secret he couldn't shake, a betrayal, an identity he couldn't share, and a haunting guilt that followed him everywhere. This is the real story of Careless Whisper. George Michael's Shame in a Song, a teenager's betrayal. George Michael wasn't a global icon when Careless Whisper was born. He was a teenager, a confused, guilt-ridden 17-year-old trying to make sense of the consequences of his own actions. The song didn't start in a polished studio or glamorous writing retreat. It began on the back of a bus during a quiet moment with his best friend in Wham, bandmate Andrew Ridgeley. George had recently betrayed someone who trusted him. He'd been seeing a girl he genuinely liked, but while still in that relationship, he had a brief affair with another woman. To most people, it might have seemed like a youthful mistake, but to George, it cut deeper. He carried that guilt around like a shadow, unable to shake the shame of hurting someone emotionally. He once said, "That song came from a real place. I was young, but the guilt, that was very real." He began writing lyrics that reflected that emotional burden. Guilty feet have got no rhythm. It was more than just a clever line. It was a self-portrait, a quiet admission that his actions had consequences, and those consequences had changed how he saw himself. That line, those 6 words, became the emotional anchor of the entire song. It was his way of telling the world, "I'm not the hero of this story." And yet, somehow, in translating personal pain into music, George stumbled onto something bigger, a melody so beautiful and raw that it would become timeless. But turning that confession into a global hit would take more than raw emotion. It would take reinvention and rejection. A song that almost didn't make it. By the time George Michael was ready to record Careless Whisper, he already knew it was special. The melody had haunted him since his teenage years. The lyrics felt like a diary entry he never meant to publish. But making the world feel that same intensity, that was another challenge entirely. In 1983, George flew to the legendary Muscle Shoals studio in Alabama, hoping to bring the song to life with a team of respected session musicians. These were the same halls where Aretha Franklin and the Rolling Stones had laid down classics. Expectations were sky high, but almost immediately, something felt wrong. The sound was slick, polished, but empty. George would later describe the take as a weak impersonation of Barry White. The groove was too smooth, the soul was missing. For a song built on guilt, shame, and emotional weight, the original version was just too clean. He listened back to the demo and felt nothing. No lump in his throat, no tension in his chest, just disappointment. This wasn't the song that had haunted him. It was a studio imitation of Heartbreak. And so, in a move that shocked the label and the crew, George scrapped the entire thing. Every instrumental track, every vocal line, gone. He refused to release something that didn't feel true. This was the first sign of how obsessively perfectionist George really was. He wasn't chasing a hit. He was chasing honesty. Even if it meant starting over, even if it meant clashing with producers, he knew one thing. The song had to feel like a confession, not just sound like one. Back in London, George took matters into his own hands. He re-recorded Careless Whisper with a brand new arrangement and began shaping every note, every vocal, every breath. And when the saxophone finally hit the way he imagined, he knew. He had captured the shame, the sadness, the secret. But as the world prepared to fall in love with the song, George began to realize something deeply unsettling. He didn't want to be seen, the shame beneath the spotlight. When Careless Whisper was finally complete, it sounded flawless. The haunting saxophone, the aching lyrics, the soft falsetto, everything aligned perfectly. The industry was thrilled, fans were enchanted, and the record label could smell a #1 hit. But George Michael wasn't celebrating. Instead of feeling triumphant, he felt exposed. The song that had been born out of a teenage mistake had transformed into a global confessional. And now he had to relive it night after night, performance after performance. Each time he stepped up to the mic, he was reminded of a version of himself he wasn't proud of. In interviews, George was startlingly candid about his discomfort. He once said, "I'm your man when it comes to being honest about music. And honestly, Careless Whisper isn't something I ever felt good singing." He went even further in later years, calling it emotionally dishonest, saying it came from a place of inexperience and artificiality. To the public, the song was elegant and sensual. But to George, it was a lie, because at the time, he was lying about who he truly was. He hadn't yet come out as gay, and the song, centered around a heterosexual affair, felt like a mask. A beautiful, shimmering mask that didn't reflect the person underneath. That inner conflict only deepened as the song gained traction. As it soared up the charts, George felt increasingly boxed in by the image it painted, the smooth, romantic, straight male crooner. But that wasn't his truth. He was a young man grappling with identity, hiding from the spotlight even as it followed him everywhere. He later confessed that he had no real understanding of love when he wrote it, only the weight of guilt. "I was just a kid who did something wrong, but the world turned it into poetry." And as millions embraced the ballad, George quietly began to question what kind of artist he really wanted to be, and whether telling the truth would cost him everything. A global smash and an identity crisis. When Careless Whisper was finally released in 1984, it didn't just become a hit, it became a phenomenon. The song skyrocketed to #1 in 25 countries, including the UK and the US, and it turned George Michael into a household name overnight. The haunting sax solo and the slick video featuring a brooding George leaning against a balcony in Miami gave the world a new romantic hero. But there was something confusing about the release. The single was credited to George Michael alone, not to Wham. This created a strange tension. At the time, Wham was still very much alive and rising. George and Andrew Ridgeley had just exploded with hits like "Wake Me Up Before You Go Go." They were supposed to be a duo, equals in fame and stage presence. But Careless Whisper quietly shifted the spotlight and made it clear who the star truly was. George later admitted that releasing it as a solo track was a decision pushed by the label, but one he agreed with. He knew deep down that Wham had an expiration date. Careless Whisper didn't just signal a new musical era, it foreshadowed the end of the band that had launched him. Behind the scenes, George was changing, fast. He was growing more ambitious, more introspective, and increasingly aware of the bubblegum pop image of Wham didn't reflect who he was or who he wanted to become. The more fans screamed his name, the more he realized they didn't actually know him at all. He once said, "I was trying to be honest in my music, but I was still hiding." That's what made Careless Whisper so powerful and so painful. It was the first time George had cracked the mask just enough to show the world his inner turmoil, but the world was too busy dancing to notice. And while the public obsessed over the sound, few realized the song's most unforgettable element, the saxophone solo, almost didn't happen at all. The secret behind the sax. It's arguably the most recognizable saxophone riff in pop history, seductive, smooth, unforgettable. But behind that silky sound was chaos, frustration, and an almost obsessive pursuit of perfection. When George Michael began reworking Careless Whisper in London, he knew the saxophone would be the emotional core of the song. It had to do more than just sound good. It had to ache. It had to cry for him. Because George couldn't say what he really felt, he needed that instrument to speak on his behalf. But getting the right sound was a nightmare. Multiple top-tier session saxophonists were brought in, one after the other. Each played the notes flawlessly. But something was always missing. Too clean, too technical, too lifeless. The emotion just wasn't there. George was relentless. He sat through take after take, sometimes making players feel like they were being tested more than guided. One musician even stormed out of the studio in frustration, saying George didn't know what he wanted. But that wasn't true. George knew exactly what he wanted. He just couldn't find anyone to deliver it. Finally, after nearly giving up, a seasoned saxophonist named Steve Gregory was called in. Gregory didn't just play the solo, he listened. He understood that George wasn't chasing technical perfection. He was chasing emotional clarity. George stood beside him during the session, meticulously coaching each phrase, not just where to breathe, but how to feel. He needed the sax to tremble on certain notes, to slide with a kind of guilt-soaked smoothness. After hours of back and forth, Gregory finally nailed it. When the final take played back, George's reaction said it all. He smiled tightly and whispered, "That's it." The solo was no longer just an intro, it was a confession. It captured the vulnerability George couldn't sing, the shame he couldn't name, and the regret he carried silently. But as powerful as that solo was, it couldn't mask the growing fracture between the artist he pretended to be and the one he was hiding from the world. Singing about a woman while hiding his truth. Every time George Michael stepped on stage to sing Careless Whisper, he was telling a story. But it wasn't quite his own. The world heard a man tormented by a romantic mistake with a woman. But George was living a double life, haunted not only by guilt, but by secrecy. At the time of the song's release, George wasn't out as gay. In fact, few people in his inner circle even knew the truth. And in the mid-1980s, being openly gay, especially in the pop world, was still considered a career-ending risk. The pressure to conform to the public's image of a desirable, heterosexual heartthrob was overwhelming. So when George sang lines like, "I'm never gonna dance again, the way I danced with you," he wasn't just singing about a past fling. He was masking his identity in lyrics he no longer felt represented him. The woman in the song became symbolic, a stand-in for what the world expected of him, a narrative he felt trapped inside. He later reflected, "I was confused about who I was and how I wanted to present myself. Singing about love when you haven't figured out your own, it's complicated." That complication bled into his performances. There's a reason his delivery of Careless Whisper feels so raw, so hollow, even as the crowd sings every word. He was putting on a show, not just musically, but emotionally, and the more the song was celebrated as a sensual anthem, the more isolated he felt inside it. Fans saw the video, a gorgeous man brooding on a yacht, dancing with a beautiful woman under city lights. But behind the lens, George felt like an actor in his own story. The song was about betrayal, but for George, the greatest betrayal was pretending to be someone he wasn't. And when he finally revealed the truth years later, Careless Whisper transformed again, not just into a hit, but into a tragic reminder of the emotional toll of hiding in plain sight. A legacy of regret and redemption. Even though Careless Whisper became one of the most iconic ballads of the 1980s, George Michael never fully embraced it. He never removed it from his set lists, but he rarely spoke of it with pride. Instead, he often described it with a mixture of detachment and discomfort, like a scar he couldn't hide, but also couldn't forget. In interviews, he called it too naive, emotionally dishonest, and even embarrassing. But he kept singing it, night after night. Why? Because he knew it didn't belong to just him anymore. Over the years, Careless Whisper had become something larger than the story of a teenage mistake. It was the sound of heartbreak, of longing, of regret, for millions of people around the world. Fans wept, lovers danced to it. People going through breakups clung to it like a friend who understood. And George, as much as he struggled with the song's origins, couldn't ignore the way it helped others process their own pain. In a way, Careless Whisper became a mirror. For George, it reflected the guilt and confusion of his younger self. But for his fans, it reflected their own broken pieces, their own silent grief. The song's meaning shifted with time. What started as personal shame became collective healing. By the time George came out publicly in 1998, the world had changed. He had changed. And Careless Whisper, though still painful, stood as a symbol of everything he had survived: secrecy, judgment, heartbreak, and ultimately, acceptance. In one of his final tours, when the familiar saxophone opened the set and the crowd erupted in cheers, George no longer sang the song with shame. He sang it with understanding, with maturity, and with a quiet sort of forgiveness for himself. Because sometimes the songs we regret the most are the ones that end up saving us. And so, the legacy of Careless Whisper isn't just about betrayal or sorrow, it's about transformation. About a man who found a way to reclaim the most painful melody of his youth and turn it into something that still resonates, decades later. A hit built on guilt. In the end, Careless Whisper was never just a song. It was a burden, a secret, a beautifully wrapped confession George Michael carried for the rest of his life. What began as a teenage apology turned into a global anthem of heartbreak, yet behind every chart position, every sold-out show, and every saxophone note was a man quietly drowning in expectations, the guilt of betrayal, the weight of hiding, the fear of being truly seen. George didn't just write a song about regret, he lived it. And yet somehow, over time, that regret turned into redemption. The same track that once made him feel like a fraud became a symbol of survival, a reminder that even the most painful parts of ourselves can become something timeless, something beautiful, when we dare to put them into the world. So, the next time you hear that iconic sax solo, remember, it's not just music, it's a moment of truth, frozen in time. If you felt something watching this, hit the like button and let us know in the comments what Careless Whisper means to you. And for more untold stories behind the music you thought you knew, don't forget to subscribe to Backstage Melody. We reveal the heartbreak, the drama, and the humanity behind every hit. Because every legendary song has a story, and we're here to tell it.